There are numerous arguments for the historical reliability of the Gospels based upon their contents. These include the accuracy of the Gospel authors with respect to geographical locations and names, as well as local customs and cultural references. Then there are undesigned coincidences, unnecessary details, unexplained allusions, and unified personalities throughout the Gospels. All of these arguments have in common the idea that certain details within the Gospels are unlikely to have been fabricated because they are difficult to engineer and correspond to the known characteristics of reliable testimony. Together, they form a powerful abductive argument for the historical reliability of the Gospels. Most of these arguments have already received attention, both in writing and in videos. However, there is a further argument which I would add to this repertoire of arguments, which has not hitherto been developed in any detail, at least not to my knowledge. I call this the argument from forced fulfilled prophecy. The basic phenomenon upon which this argument is built is fairly straightforward and uncontroversial. There are instances in the Gospels where the authors of the Gospels essentially force certain events within Jesus' life to fulfill Old Testament prophecies in such a way that the fulfillment is clunky and awkward. The fulfillment is not obvious and does not arise naturally from the text. Let me detail a few examples so that viewers can get a feel for what I'm talking about. A good example of this is found in Matthew 2:15. After describing Joseph and Mary's flight to Egypt to save Jesus from Herod's slaughter of the innocents, we read, "He, Jesus, stayed there in Egypt until the death of Herod. This happened so that what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet would be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son." An issue arises when we read the corresponding passage in Hosea 11:1, for it seems that the verse is not talking about the Messiah at all, but rather is presenting a personification of Israel. "When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." The author of the Gospel of Matthew seems to have forced a prophetic connection between an event in the life of Jesus and this passage in Hosea. He has forced a fulfillment of prophecy. As Craig Blomberg points out, Matthew, then, is clearly writing not merely as a historian, but as a theologian with apologetic motives to show Jesus as the true fulfillment of Old Testament hopes for a perfect Davidic king. This has implications for contemporary apologetics, too. It is sometimes observed that there are over 200 fulfillments of prophecy in the Gospels, and that the odds of all these coalescing around one individual are microscopically small. The problem is that only a handful of the Old Testament texts, fulfilled in the Gospels, are of the straightforward predictive variety. The author of the Gospel of Matthew does this again in Matthew 13:34-35. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet, "I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter hidden things since the creation of the world." But again, when we check the reference in Psalm 28:1-7, it appears that this is just God speaking to Israel with no prophetic intent whatsoever. "Listen, my people, to my instruction. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will tell riddles of old." Again, we see the author of Matthew's Gospel forcing connections when one doesn't seem to have been intended by the Old Testament author. We see this again in Matthew 4:12-17. When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. "Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned." Now, while the reference in Isaiah 9:1-12 is somewhat prophetic, it's not really predicting what the author of Matthew's Gospel is claiming. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan. "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned." So the connection which Matthew is drawing appears unnatural and forced. We see the same pattern in John 19:28 through 29. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, he said, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. The putative prophecy being fulfilled in this case is Psalm 69:21, which says, They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink. But this is really quite a stretch, as Psalm 69 is certainly not prophetic, and Jesus was never offered poisonous food on the cross. The fulfillment is artificial, forced by the author of John's Gospel. This phenomenon, as we have seen, is especially pervasive throughout the Gospel of Matthew. As R.T. France observes, copious quotations of and allusions to the Old Testament is not so much, of course, peculiar to Matthew. It is found throughout the New Testament, some books of which would match and even exceed the statistics given above. But among the Gospels, Matthew stands out for his sustained and creative presentation of this theme of fulfillment in Jesus, and it comes to its most characteristic expression in this series of so-called formula quotations, which are a distinctive feature of this Gospel. However, the phenomenon is not restricted to Matthew alone. It consistently turns up in John chapter 19, and it can be found to a lesser extent in Mark and Luke as well. Furthermore, it can be found in Acts, which, by most accounts, has the same author as the Gospel of Luke and has similar purposes. Consequently, whatever implications the phenomenon has for Acts will likewise apply to Luke. So having established that there is a genuine phenomenon of forced fulfillment throughout the Gospels, and to some extent in Acts, the question arises as to why it exists. For many Christians who, like myself, hold to a high view of Scripture, this phenomenon may initially seem embarrassing. After all, at first blush, it looks like the authors of the Gospels are badly misreading the Old Testament, thinking that it is predicting things which it never even purports to talk about, or are just blatantly ripping verses out of context. However, it is quite implausible that all of the clearly educated authors of the Gospels could be getting the Old Testament wrong this much, and this should motivate us to push a little deeper. As Klein Snodgrass reminds us, we must be careful of imposing contemporary interpretive standards upon the New Testament writers, which liberal scholars tend to do, and imposing unnatural interpretations on a prophecy as fulfillment of prediction, when prediction was not in view by the Old Testament or New Testament writer, as conservatives tend to do. Ancient Jewish people often employed a method of biblical interpretation known as Midrash, which, in certain forms, sought to find new allegorical meaning in certain texts within the ancient Hebrew Bible. As Moises Silva reminds us, the process of interpretation that began in Old Testament times grew through oral and sometimes written tradition over many centuries, with the New Testament writers right in the middle of the process. Even the wildest Talmudic application may be the result of layer upon layer of deduction, so that we cannot see the connection between the beginning and the end. It may be that New Testament writers, without rejecting such a hermeneutical process in principle, avoid its extreme application. It may be, indeed, that the difference between biblical and rabbinic interpretation in this respect is quantitative rather than qualitative. If so, we need not be surprised at the presence of difficult passages in the New Testament that reveal similarities to rabbinic methods. Given that we know that this practice was relatively accepted among the ancient Jews, this becomes a likely candidate for explaining what is going on in the passages surveyed above. The Gospel writers were seeking new meanings in these ancient texts. But why the awkwardness and clunky attempts to find predictions about the life of Jesus? Well, now we are in a position to erect the argument from forced fulfilled prophecy. I propose that the forced nature of the fulfillment is best explained by the Gospel authors genuinely reporting the actual events of Jesus' life and then actively seeking to find those events within the Old Testament. This hypothesis explains the clunkiness because it posits that the Gospel authors essentially had one hand tied by the facts of history. They had to force the text of the Old Testament to conform to the realities which had transpired during Jesus' life. Consider the alternative. If the Gospel authors had not felt constrained by the facts of history, and had instead felt free to make things up at will, then they could have easily reduced the awkwardness within their narratives. For example, rather than having Jesus tell parables in Matthew 13:34 through 35, the author of Matthew's Gospel could have had Jesus tell both a riddle and a parable, which would have been much closer to what is actually said in Psalm 78, 1 through 2, which is the text that the author of Matthew claims that Jesus fulfilled. But he doesn't. He awkwardly leaves only half of this supposed prediction fulfilled when he could have easily had it been entirely fulfilled. R.T. France comments, Matthew, for good theological reasons, took the historical dimension of his task seriously, that he was interested in recording for his church the events of the life and teaching of Jesus, in which he saw fulfillment as having come. To have a theology of fulfillment in Jesus is not incompatible with, but indeed rather demands, the careful recording of history. Similarly, if the author of John's Gospel were simply making things up, he could have easily had Jesus be offered actual poison on the cross, or at some other point in his narrative, which would have been a clear fulfillment of Psalm 69:21. What this suggests is that the Gospel authors were intending to accurately relay what they believed to be the facts of history, and were not willing to change them in order to make Jesus more clearly fulfill these supposed prophecies. C.H. Dodd argues as follows, certainly there is a close relation between the testimonies and the earliest formulation of Christian theology, but the theology depended upon the testimony and not vice versa. It was not to provide documentation for a previously formulated theology that the early church searched the scriptures. It was to find an explanation for attested facts, many of which appeared to run counter to their inherited beliefs, and even counter to the scriptures as they were currently understood. The facts themselves exerted pressure upon their understanding of prophecy and fulfillment, and dictated the selection of testimonies. Fundamentally, the framers of the tradition were in bondage to the facts, although here and there they strained at their bonds. And Gregory Boyd adds, if the Jesus of the Gospels is created from the Old Testament texts he fulfills, why does he fulfill some of these texts so awkwardly? To my mind, the very fact that the Jesus portrayed in the four Gospels often fulfills Old Testament passages so awkwardly is strong evidence that the authors of these works were not creating a portrait of Jesus on the basis of these passages. To the contrary, this awkwardness rather demonstrates that these authors were striving to find new Christocentric meaning in the Old Testament on the basis of events that actually took place in the life and ministry of Jesus. Now, to be sure, some of these awkwardly fulfilled prophecies can be explained in other ways. For example, one might think that the claim that Matthew 2:15 is a fulfillment of Hosea 11 when it says, "Out of Egypt I called my son," is such an awkward fit because the author of Matthew is attempting to make Jesus fit a new Moses typology. That is to say, the author of Matthew wants Jesus' life to parallel Moses' life. So just as Pharaoh had the Israelite children slaughtered when Moses was born, Matthew has Herod slaughter the children of Bethlehem when Jesus is born. Just as Moses left Egypt, the author of Matthew has Jesus leave Egypt, and then cites Hosea 11:1 here to make the connection. In this case, the element of clunkiness or awkwardness is being explained by the author having to force-fit his story into Moses' story. As W.D. Davies argues, this brings us to the second element of fulfillment set forth in Matthew. Jesus is a second Moses. Fortunately, we are spared from speculation because a direct quotation guides us at once to the Exodus. In Matthew 2:13, the flight of Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus to Egypt and their sojourn there is described, and in 2:15, it is asserted that this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." Now, I actually think that this alternative hypothesis works in this instance, and perhaps in a few others. However, it is not going to explain the full range of these sorts of forced fulfilled prophecies. For example, Matthew's claim that Jesus fulfilled Isaiah's prophecy regarding Zebulun and Naphtali has nothing to do with the life of Moses. Similarly, John's claim that Jesus being offered sour wine on the cross is a fulfillment of Psalm 69:21 has no connection to the life of Moses. So the idea that the awkwardness of these alleged prophetic fulfillments is due to the authors attempting to make connections between actual historical events in the Old Testament has greater explanatory power and scope than the idea that it is due to a forced attempt to make Jesus fit some Moses archetype. As France explains, in several cases, notably Hosea 11:1 and Jeremiah 31:15, the text would have no reason to be brought into connection with the story of Jesus, apart from the specific content of the incident to which it relates. There is the mutual interaction between story and text, the latter being chosen because of its relevance to the event being narrated, but the story being told in terms which draw attention to the correspondence. I have never yet seen a proposed hypothesis which explains all of the awkward forced fulfillments of prophecy found throughout the Gospels and Acts nearly as well as the hypothesis that the Gospel authors are simply constraining themselves to the facts of history. So, by inference to the best explanation, and until skeptics give us a better hypothesis, we may infer that the phenomenon of forced fulfilled prophecy provides yet another piece of evidence for the historical reliability of the Gospels and Acts. While this phenomenon has often been trotted out by skeptics of the faith as an argument against the Bible, and has often been a source of embarrassment for believers, if I am right, this phenomenon actually provides important evidence for the substantial historical trustworthiness of the Bible. This video has explored the thorny issue of the Gospels and Acts apparently taking verses from the Old Testament out of their original contexts to support their own theological points. I have argued that this is a genuine pattern in the New Testament. However, I have argued that, contrary to initial appearances, this pattern is best explained by reference to the Gospel authors constraining themselves to the facts of history, preferring to let the awkwardness remain rather than alter the facts for a more seamless fulfillment. If I am right about this, far from being something to feel embarrassment over, this phenomenon of forced fulfilled prophecy should increase the Christian's confidence in the historical reliability of the New Testament. And I will close with the words of R.T. France, who said, "It is rather from the gospel itself, from its expressed interests and apparent aims, that we should try to understand how Matthew envisaged his task. We have seen reason above to believe that Matthew had a strong sense of the importance of history, and we have focused throughout this chapter on his conviction that in that history was to be found the fulfillment of God's purposes as set out in the Old Testament and the history of Israel. Fulfillment and history are not in conflict. Rather, the fulfillment takes place in history. Indeed, it is not easy to see quite what fulfillment might mean if there is no actual history in which the pattern is fulfilled. Matthew's undoubted enthusiasm for discovering patterns of fulfillment and the subtlety of the interpretive methods he has employed to draw attention to them, which has led to the comparison of his work with some aspects of later Midrash, should be seen not as weakening his sense of historical responsibility, but rather as demanding a careful record of the facts on which the whole claim to fulfillment depends."